For as long as humans have existed, violence has followed us. It is written into our bones, marked by fractures that healed and fractures that did not. It appears in our earliest art, carved into stone and painted onto cave walls. It echoes through our myths, our religions, our empires, and our wars. No matter how advanced we become, the question refuses to disappear. Why are humans so violent? How can a species capable of empathy, cooperation, and creativity also be capable of destruction on a massive scale? Why does violence persist even when it destroys families, societies, and entire civilizations? To answer this, we must move beyond comfort and morality. Violence is not caused by one gene, not by one culture, not by one moment in history. It is the result of layers. Layers of biology, psychology, environment, and circumstance. Layers built over hundreds of thousands of years. To understand human violence, we must begin where humanity itself began. For more than 95% of human history, there were no nations, no laws, no police, and no courts. There were only small groups of people trying to survive in a hostile world. Food was uncertain, weather was unforgiving, injury often meant death, and other humans competed for the same land, water, and resources. In this world, violence was not an abstract concept. It was immediate, personal, and sometimes necessary. Aggression helped early humans defend territory. It helped protect children, it helped secure mates, and in moments of desperation, it helped secure food. This does not mean early humans lived in constant bloodshed. Most of daily life depended on cooperation. Groups shared food, they cared for the injured, they raised children together. But when violence occurred, it mattered. Natural selection does not remove traits that are occasionally useful, it preserves them. Those who could defend themselves and their group were more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, more likely to pass on their traits. Over time, the capacity for violence became part of the human toolkit. Not a default behavior, but an option that never disappeared. As humans evolved, their brains grew larger and more complex, but civilization evolved faster than biology. The human brain was shaped for survival in a dangerous world, not for life in crowded cities, anonymous societies, and constant social comparison. Deep within the brain sits an ancient structure called the amygdala. It acts as a threat detector, scanning the environment for danger at all times. When it senses a threat, it reacts before conscious thought even begins. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, stress hormones flood the body, rational thinking slows. This is the fight or flight response. In the prehistoric world, this response saved lives. It allowed humans to react instantly to predators and enemies. In the modern world, this same system often misfires. An insult feels like a threat. A loss of status feels like danger. Humiliation feels like attack. The brain does not distinguish between physical danger and social threat. To the amygdala, danger is danger. This is why so many violent acts are not planned, they are reactions. Road rage, sudden assaults, explosive arguments that escalate in seconds. Violence often begins not with hatred, but with fear. Humans did not evolve as isolated individuals, they evolved as members of groups. Belonging meant survival, belonging meant protection, belonging meant shared food and shared identity. From this emerged one of the most powerful forces in human behavior, tribalism, the instinct to divide the world into us and them. Within the group, humans cooperate, sacrifice, and show empathy. Outside the group, suspicion grows, empathy weakens, violence becomes easier to justify. This instinct once helped small groups survive, but as societies grew larger, its consequences became far more dangerous. Throughout history, large-scale violence almost always begins the same way, not with weapons, but with words. Enemies are described as animals, as parasites, as threats to survival. Once a group is no longer seen as fully human, harming them feels justified, even necessary. This pattern has repeated across centuries, cultures, and continents. As populations expanded, violence changed form. Small skirmishes became organized conflict. Weapons became more efficient. Leadership hierarchies emerged. Violence was no longer spontaneous, it was directed. Armies formed, borders were defended and expanded, empires rose through force. Most individuals did not want violence, they were pulled into it by loyalty, fear, obligation, or survival. Violence became systemic, and as systems grew, so did their capacity for destruction. Yet even as violence scaled up, its roots remained the same: fear, identity, scarcity, and the ancient instincts of a brain shaped for survival. This is not the end of the story. It is only the foundation.
As human societies grew larger, something changed. Violence was no longer only about survival. It became about power. In small groups, violence was personal. In large societies, it became organized. Leaders emerged, hierarchies formed, and violence became a tool that could be controlled, directed, and justified. This was the birth of institutional violence. Wars were no longer fought only to defend territory. They were fought to expand it, to extract resources, to dominate rival groups. Violence became efficient. Weapons evolved from stones and spears to swords, bows, and eventually machines of mass destruction. Each technological leap increased the distance between the person who caused harm and the person who suffered it. This distance mattered. The farther violence moved from direct human contact, the easier it became to carry out. When you no longer see the face of the person you harm, empathy weakens. This is one of the most dangerous transformations in human history. As societies expanded, tribal instincts did not disappear. They scaled up. The idea of us grew larger. The idea of them grew more abstract. Nation, religion, ideology. These became new tribes. People were no longer fighting neighbors, they were fighting symbols, flags, beliefs, stories about who belonged and who did not. Ideology gave violence a new power. It allowed people to believe they were not committing harm, but serving a higher purpose. Throughout history, some of the deadliest violence was committed not by criminals, but by ordinary people who believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were protecting their people, their faith, their future. Violence, when wrapped in moral certainty, becomes especially dangerous. Because doubt disappears, empathy becomes weakness, and cruelty becomes duty. Empires rose using this logic. They expanded by convincing their populations that conquest was necessary, that outsiders were inferior, that domination was justified. Violence was no longer an emergency response, it was policy. Yet even within empires, most people did not benefit from violence. They suffered from it. Soldiers were sent to die for causes they barely understood. Civilians were caught between power struggles they did not choose. Violence at scale does not require hatred from everyone. It only requires obedience. This is a crucial point. Most human violence is not committed by monsters. It is committed by ordinary people following orders, norms, and expectations. Psychological studies have shown this again and again. When authority legitimizes harm, many people comply. Not because they are cruel, but because they are human. Fear of punishment, desire for belonging, pressure to conform. These forces are often stronger than personal morality. As societies grew more complex, inequality increased. Power concentrated at the top. Resources became unevenly distributed. This created another major driver of violence: desperation. When people feel they have nothing to lose, violence becomes more likely. History shows a consistent pattern. When inequality becomes extreme, when food prices rise, when jobs disappear, when trust in institutions collapses, violence follows. Riots, revolutions, civil wars. Not because people suddenly become evil, but because systems stop working. When peaceful pathways close, violent ones open. Scarcity is not only about food or land, it is also about dignity. Humiliation is one of the most powerful psychological triggers of violence. When people feel disrespected, ignored, or treated as disposable, anger builds. That anger seeks release, and without healthy outlets, it often turns destructive. This is why violence often spikes during periods of social upheaval. Not because people enjoy chaos, but because they feel unheard. Violence becomes communication. As centuries passed, violence continued to evolve. It became bureaucratic. Wars were planned in offices. Deaths were recorded as numbers. Entire populations were moved, imprisoned, or erased through paperwork. The human cost became abstract. This abstraction made it easier to continue. Modern violence often hides behind systems: economic systems that exploit, political systems that exclude, social systems that marginalize. Not all violence leaves bruises. Some of it leaves poverty, trauma, and shortened lives. Psychological violence can be just as damaging as physical harm, and it accumulates. Trauma does not vanish when violence ends. It passes through generations. Children raised in violent environments are more likely to normalize aggression, not because they want to, but because it feels familiar. This creates cycles. Violence produces trauma. Trauma produces fear. Fear produces more violence. Breaking this cycle is difficult, but not impossible. Yet before we can break it, we must understand one more truth. Violence is not only something societies create, it is also something individuals carry. And the modern world places unprecedented strain on the human nervous system. Crowded cities, constant noise, endless comparison, economic pressure, social isolation. The brain evolved for small groups and simple problems. Now it faces millions of strangers and constant stimulation. Stress becomes chronic, and chronic stress changes the brain. It reduces impulse control, weakens empathy, and increases reactivity. This is why modern violence often feels sudden, explosive, irrational. It is not always planned hatred. Often it is accumulated pressure finding release. This brings us to a critical turning point in the story. Because despite everything we've explored, despite war, inequality, and ancient instincts, human violence is not constant. It rises and falls. And in recent history, something unexpected has happened. Violence, in many forms, has begun to decline. Understanding why and what threatens that progress is essential, because the future of human violence has not yet been decided.
To understand why violence rises and falls, we have to move closer to the individual human mind.
Because while societies shape violence, it is always carried out by people. And people are shaped not only by instinct, but by learning. Humans are not born knowing how to be violent. They learn when violence is acceptable. They learn who deserves it. They learn what kinds of aggression are rewarded and which are punished. This learning begins early. Children observe how adults respond to conflict. They watch how power is enforced. They absorb the emotional tone of their environment. In homes where violence is common, aggression becomes familiar. Not because children want to harm others, but because it becomes normal. The brain adapts to what it experiences most. When conflict is resolved through force, the brain learns force works. When anger is met with fear or submission, aggression is reinforced. This is how violence reproduces itself across generations, not through genetics alone, but through environment. Yet learning does not stop in childhood. Adults continue learning from culture, from media, from institutions, from social norms. When violence is portrayed as heroic, as justified, as necessary, it becomes easier to accept. This does not mean stories or media directly cause violence, but they shape the boundaries of what feels permissible. They shape how we imagine enemies and how we imagine ourselves. One of the most overlooked contributors to violence is emotional regulation. Humans are emotional beings living in rational systems, and when emotions overwhelm regulation, violence becomes more likely. This is where substances play a powerful role. Alcohol reduces inhibition. It narrows attention. It amplifies emotion. Anger becomes louder. Empathy becomes quieter. Many violent acts occur not because someone intended harm, but because self-control collapsed. Drugs can have similar effects. Some increase aggression directly. Others impair judgment. Others intensify paranoia. Combined with stress, the effects multiply. Stress is one of the most underestimated forces shaping violence. The human stress response evolved to handle short-term danger, a sudden threat, a brief crisis. But modern life produces long-term stress, financial pressure, social isolation, job insecurity, constant evaluation. The nervous system never fully resets. When stress becomes chronic, the brain changes. Impulse control weakens, patience shrinks, empathy declines. The threshold for violence lowers. This does not mean stressed people are violent by nature. It means their capacity to regulate emotion is reduced. Violence becomes more likely not because of malice, but because of overload. This is why violence often clusters in environments of high stress. Crowded housing, economic insecurity, unstable communities. The issue is not morality, it is capacity. A brain under constant pressure has less room for restraint. Trauma adds another layer. Trauma rewires the nervous system. It teaches the brain the world is unsafe. Hypervigilance becomes the default. Neutral actions feel threatening. Minor conflicts feel dangerous. For trauma survivors, violence is often preemptive, not an attack, but a defense against imagined threat. This is how violence can persist even when danger has passed. The body remembers. And trauma rarely exists in isolation. It spreads through families, through communities, through generations. This is why violence is often geographically concentrated. Not because certain places produce violent people, but because trauma accumulates. Yet despite all of this, something remarkable has happened in modern history. Violence, measured across large populations, has declined. This does not mean the world is peaceful. It means violence is less common than it once was. In ancient societies, homicide rates were astonishingly high. In some regions, a significant portion of the population died violently. Today, in many parts of the world, those rates are far lower. This change did not happen by accident. It happened because humans built systems to restrain violence. Laws replaced revenge. Courts replaced feuds. Institutions replaced personal retaliation. Violence became less necessary as cooperation became safer. When people trust that harm will be punished fairly, they are less likely to take justice into their own hands. When basic needs are met, desperation declines. When children grow up in stable environments, their nervous systems develop differently. This is one of the most hopeful findings in human history. Violence is not fixed. It responds to structure. But this progress is fragile. When institutions weaken, when inequality grows, when trust collapses, violence returns. Not because humanity regresses, but because the restraints loosen. This is why periods of peace can be followed by sudden brutality. The instincts never left, they were managed. Understanding this changes how we think about violence. It is not simply about good people and bad people. It is about systems that support restraint or remove it. It is about environments that regulate stress or amplify it. It is about whether people feel safe or threatened. Violence is not a mystery, it is a pattern, and patterns can be altered. But doing so requires facing an uncomfortable truth. Human progress did not eliminate violence, it postponed it. And the future of human violence depends on whether we continue strengthening the systems that hold it back or allow them to erode. Because while violence has declined in many places, it has not disappeared. And in some forms, it has simply changed shape. Understanding those modern forms and what they reveal about human nature is the final piece of this story.
In the modern world, violence has not disappeared, it has transformed. Much of today's violence is no longer visible in the rays it once was. It hides behind distance, systems, and screens. Technology has changed how humans interact with one another. It has connected billions of people, but it has also removed many of the natural limits on aggression. In face-to-face interaction, violence carries immediate consequences. We see the reaction, we feel the discomfort. Empathy has space to operate. But distance weakens restraint. When communication is filtered through screens, the human nervous system reacts differently. An insult typed on a keyboard feels safer than one spoken aloud. Anger can be released without witnessing its impact. Dehumanization becomes easier. This does not create violent instincts, it amplifies existing ones. The brain evolved for small social circles. In the digital age, it is exposed to thousands of strangers every day. This overload creates constant low-level threat perception. Outrage becomes addictive. Fear spreads rapidly. Group identities harden. Digital tribalism forms faster than physical tribes ever could. And when identity becomes rigid, violence becomes easier to justify. Modern violence is often psychological before it is physical. Harassment, intimidation, public shaming, systematic exclusion. These forms of harm rarely leave visible scars, but they alter behavior, mental health, and trust. Over time, psychological violence erodes social cohesion, and when cohesion breaks down, physical violence becomes more likely. Another transformation of modern violence is its invisibility. Some of the most harmful violence today is structural. Poverty that shortens lives, pollution that damages health, systems that deny opportunity. These harms do not look like attacks, but their effects are real. Violence does not always arrive with weapons. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays for generations. Yet, even in this complex modern world, the long-term trend remains remarkable. Across much of human history, violence has declined. This did not happen because humans became morally superior. It happened because societies learned how to restrain their instincts. Legal systems replaced personal revenge, institutions reduced uncertainty, education improved emotional regulation, healthcare reduced desperation. Violence declined where predictability increased. Where people trusted that harm would be addressed fairly, they were less likely to take justice into their own hands. Where basic needs were met, survival no longer required aggression. This tells us something crucial. Human violence is not inevitable, it is conditional. It rises when people feel threatened, it falls when people feel secure. This does not mean peace is permanent. The same forces that reduced violence can weaken. Economic instability, environmental stress, political polarization. When uncertainty grows, the old instincts resurface. The human brain has not changed, only the conditions around it have, and those conditions are fragile. This is why moments of rapid change are dangerous. Technological disruption, climate pressure, resource scarcity, each adds stress to systems already under strain. When stress outpaces adaptation, violence finds space to grow. But this is not a prediction of collapse, it is a warning. History shows that when societies invest in fairness, in stability, and in trust, violence declines. When they abandon those foundations, violence returns. The future of human violence is not written in our genes, it is written in our choices. Every policy that reduces inequality, every system that increases accountability, every effort to reduce chronic stress, these are not abstract ideals, they are violence prevention. Understanding violence does not excuse it, it disarms it. When we see violence not as a mystery or a moral flaw, but as a predictable response to threat and instability, we gain the ability to reduce it. Humans are capable of extraordinary cruelty, but we are equally capable of restraint. Violence is not humanity's destiny, it is humanity's challenge. And every generation decides whether that challenge is met or ignored. If you've stayed with this documentary to the end, you've looked directly at one of the most uncomfortable truths about our species. Not to condemn humanity, but to understand it. Because only what is understood can be changed. If you want more long-form documentaries exploring human nature, science, and history, subscribe to No Verse Official. New documentaries every week.